In the remote valleys of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, where winter fog clings to the hollows like the fingers of ghosts, there are stories of survival that defy belief. This is one of them. If you found a dying man in the snow worth $1,000 in reward money, would you save him or let him freeze? The answer one Apache widow gave on that bitter December day in 1883 would change two destinies forever. The sound echoed through the frozen pines like thunder. Gunfire, sharp and sudden, splitting the silence of the New Mexico wilderness. 3 shots. Then, nothing but the whisper of snow falling through bare branches. A voice, rough as gravel, cut through the cold air somewhere in the distance. "Found blood. He's heading east." Hoofbeats pounded the frozen ground, fading toward the ridgeline. Behind a massive oak, a hand gripped a hunting knife. The knuckles were white, trembling from cold or pain, or both. The hand belonged to a man who knew these mountains better than most, a man who had learned long ago that silence could mean the difference between life and death. The riders passed, 3 of them, moving fast through the skeletal trees. Then silence again. Snow continued to fall, soft and relentless, covering everything, including the dark red stain spreading across the white ground. Sarah Nighthawk stood in front of her cabin, an axe in her hands, her breath forming clouds in the December air. She was 27 years old, 9 months a widow, and facing her first winter truly alone. Behind her, the cabin Thomas had built 3 years ago looked smaller every day. Smoke rose from the stone chimney he had laid with his own hands, back when they still believed the mine would make them prosperous, back when he still came home every night. That was before the collapse, before Blackwood Mining Company sent their regrets and a small payment that barely covered the burial. Before Sarah learned what it meant to be truly alone, with 2 children and a baby, and the weight of a husband's memory pressing down on her chest until she could barely breathe. "Mama, I'm finished." Lily appeared in the doorway, 9 years old and far too serious for her age. She held up the kindling she had been stripping, each piece cleaned with a small knife her father had given her. The knife she now used with the precision of someone who understood that survival required skills most children never learned. "Good work, sweetheart. Stack it by the door." Sarah split another log, feeling the impact travel up her arms. Her back ached. Her hands were raw despite the gloves. But the woodpile was nearly gone, and another storm was coming. She could smell it in the air. That particular scent of snow and cold that promised 3 or 4 days trapped inside with whatever food and fuel they had managed to gather. Daniel appeared next to his sister, 6 years old and swimming in his father's cut-down coat. "Mama, I heard something, like thunder." Sarah stopped mid-swing. She had heard it too. Gunfire, coming from the direction of Blackthorn Creek, maybe 2 miles away. Rare, but not unheard of. Hunters, probably. Or someone chasing game through the frozen forest. But the timing felt wrong. The location felt wrong. Everything about it set off alarms in the part of her mind that still remembered her Apache grandfather's teachings about reading danger in the wilderness. "Just thunder, baby. Go inside and help your sister with the fire." But it wasn't thunder, and Sarah knew it. The children disappeared into the cabin, and Sarah stood alone in the yard, listening. The forest was too quiet. The birds had stopped singing. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Something was wrong. She looked toward the tree line where the pines stood dark against the gray sky. Nothing moved, nothing made a sound, but the feeling persisted. That animal instinct that told her danger was close. that the world had shifted in some fundamental way. Sarah gathered the firewood and went inside, barring the door behind her. Through the cabin's small window, she watched the forest as darkness began to fall. She checked on Grace, 7 months old, sleeping peacefully in the wooden cradle by the fire, unaware that her father would never come home, unaware that the world outside was anything but safe and warm and kind. People say the winter of 1883 was the coldest in 50 years, but the frozen ground and bitter wind were nothing compared to the cold of loneliness. Thomas had been dead 9 months. The baby was healthy, and Sarah had just begun to believe she might survive this after all. Then morning came, and with it, everything changed. Lily was the first to wake. She always was, rising before dawn to help her mother start the fire, to heat water for the thin oatmeal that would have to stretch through the day. She was putting on her boots when she heard it. A sound, low and broken, like an animal in pain, coming from outside. "Mama." She shook Sarah awake, her small hand insistent on her mother's shoulder. "Mama, there's something in the woods." Sarah sat up instantly, alert. In the mountains, sounds in the night meant danger. Bears, sometimes. Mountain lions, rarely. Men, occasionally. And those were the worst kind of danger. She reached for Thomas's rifle, checking the load by habit, the weight of it familiar in her hands. "Stay with Daniel. Don't open the door for anyone." The snow had stopped during the night, leaving everything covered in a fresh blanket of white that reflected the early morning light in shades of blue and silver. Sarah's breath frosted in the air as she stepped off the porch, rifle ready, following the sound. It led her toward the creek, past the bare birch trees, through the laurel thicket that grew thick along the water. The sound came again, weaker now, a moan, distinctly human. She found him at the edge of the frozen creek, half buried in snow. At first glance, he looked like the forest itself had taken human form. Hair black as midnight pines, long and tangled with snow and ice hanging past his shoulders. A beard thick and dark, hiding most of his face, but unable to conceal the sharp line of his jaw or the blue tinge creeping into his lips. He was massive, easily 6'3" of solid, mountain-bred muscle. His shoulders were broad as an ox yoke beneath a torn deerskin coat. His arms, visible where the sleeve had ripped, showed the corded muscle of a man who split logs and hauled game through steep terrain without complaint. Even unconscious and pale from blood loss, he radiated a kind of raw, physical power that came from years of hard mountain living. Blood soaked through his left shoulder, dark against the leather. His breathing came shallow and labored, each exhale sending up a small cloud of vapor that proved he was still alive. Barely. Sarah knelt beside him, professional instinct overriding fear. She had learned healing from her Apache grandfather, had watched her mother tend wounds. The bullet hole was high on the shoulder, had bled extensively, but seemed to have missed the major arteries. He would live if he didn't freeze first. That was when she noticed his hands. Large, yes, calloused from hard work, but clean. The nails were trimmed, not ragged. These were not the hands of a drifter or a common outlaw living rough in the wilderness. These were the hands of a man who, despite his mountain man appearance, maintained some measure of civilization, some connection to the world beyond mere survival. A scar ran from his ear to his chin, old and white against weathered skin. His face, what she could see of it beneath the beard, was strong-featured, bore the look of someone who had seen too much sun and not enough sleep. Someone running from something, or toward something. She couldn't tell which. She should leave him. Every practical instinct screamed it. A stranger this far into the mountains, shot and running, meant trouble, meant danger, meant risk to her children, to Grace sleeping peacefully in her cradle, to Lily and Daniel, who had already lost one parent and didn't deserve to lose another. But Sarah Nighthawk had been raised with the teachings of both her Apache grandfather and her white mother. She had been taught that mercy was not optional, that the measure of a soul was found in how it treated those who could offer nothing in return. Thomas had believed it too. "We're only as strong as our compassion," he used to say. "Take that away, and we're just animals pretending to be human." The decision made itself. Somewhere between seeing the man's blue-tinged lips and remembering Thomas's words, somewhere between fear and faith. "Lily," Sarah called toward the cabin, her voice carrying through the still morning air. "Bring the sled and rope." Her daughter appeared within minutes, eyes wide at the sight of the unconscious man, a giant bleeding in the snow like something from the old stories Red Skywalker used to tell. Stories of warriors and spirits, and the thin line between life and death. "Mama, who is he?" "Someone who needs help. That's all we need to know right now." Together they managed to get him onto the small sled Thomas had built for hauling firewood. The man was heavy, dead weight, but Sarah had grown strong from 9 months of doing everything herself. From chopping wood and hauling water and carrying a baby and refusing to break under the weight of widow's grief. Lily pulled from the front, small but determined. Sarah pushed from behind, and slowly, painfully, they dragged him through the snow toward the cabin. Daniel stood in the doorway, frightened eyes watching as they brought the stranger inside. As they maneuvered him through the narrow door and laid him by the fireplace where the heat might have some chance of reaching him, Grace woke and began to cry, the sound piercing and insistent. But Sarah couldn't tend to her yet, not until she had done what she could for this man who might die in her home if she didn't work fast enough. She cut away his blood-soaked coat, exposing the wound. The bullet had gone through, clean. That was good. Less risk of infection. She packed it with golden seal root, applied yarrow leaves to stop the bleeding, bound it tight with strips of clean cloth she kept for emergencies, all the while working with steady hands that betrayed none of the fear hammering in her chest. The man's eyes fluttered open, just for a moment, green as moss on wet stone, sharp and intelligent, despite the fever already beginning to burn through him. They fixed on Sarah's face with an intensity that made her catch her breath. Then they closed again, and he was gone, back into unconsciousness. "Ma'am." His voice was rough, barely a whisper. "I'm sorry for the trouble." "Be quiet. You'll live if you don't talk." Sarah finished binding the wound, then turned to tend to Grace, to reassure Lily and Daniel that everything was going to be all right, even though she had no idea if that was true. She fed the baby, settled the children, built up the fire until the cabin was warm enough that the stranger might have a chance. Only then did she allow herself to look at what else had spilled from his pack when Lily dragged it inside. A hunting knife, 12 inches of forged steel with a worn leather grip, a tin cup, spare ammunition, and a piece of paper, folded and worn from repeated handling. Sarah picked it up, her hands trembling as she unfolded it. The crude drawing showed a man's face, younger than the one lying by her fire, harder, but unmistakably the same. Below the image, words that made her blood run cold. Jacob Bear McAllister. Murder, Arson, assault on peace officers, $1,000 reward, wanted, dead or alive. For a long moment, Sarah stared at the poster. $1,000. More money than she had seen since Thomas died. More than enough to pay off their debts to the company store, to buy food and supplies for the entire winter, to give her children a chance at something better than slow starvation in a frozen cabin. All she had to do was turn in the man lying unconscious by her fire. She looked at him, really looked, at the peace on his face, despite the pain he must be in, at the way his hand, even in sleep, stayed near where his weapons would have been, ready to defend himself, ready to fight, but also at the gentleness in the way his fingers curled, as if even in unconsciousness, some part of him remembered holding something precious. Sarah thought about the $1,000, thought about her children, thought about survival and pragmatism, and all the hard choices widowhood had forced her to make. Then she thought about Thomas, about the man who had married an Apache woman when half the town said he shouldn't, who had raised their mixed-blood children with pride, who had believed that doing right mattered more than doing easy. She walked to the fireplace, held the wanted poster over the flames, watched it curl and blacken and turn to ash. Then she turned back to the stranger, to Jacob Bear McAllister. Wanted man, fugitive, and possibly the most dangerous choice she had ever made. But also possibly something else, something she couldn't yet name, something that felt like the first hint of hope she had known in 9 long months of winter. The man would live or die by morning. Either way, Sarah had made her choice. And whatever came next, she would face it the way she faced everything else, with her children protected, her conscience clear, and her faith that sometimes the right choice and the safe choice were not the same thing at all. The stranger fought the fever for 3 days. Sarah watched over him with the careful attention her grandfather had taught her. She changed the bandages twice daily, fed him willow bark tea when he was conscious enough to swallow, applied cool cloths to his burning forehead when the fever spiked in the nights. Lily and Daniel kept their distance, watching the massive man with the wide eyes of children who understood that something important was happening, something that might change their lives in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. On the morning of the 4th day, Jacob Bear McAllister opened his eyes, and they stayed open. Sarah was tending the fire when it happened. She turned to check on him and found him watching her, those green eyes clear now, focused, taking in the cabin, the children, the situation he found himself in, with the sharp assessment of a man accustomed to calculating odds and outcomes. "Ma'am," his voice was still rough but stronger, "am I alive?" Sarah set down the poker, walked to where he lay, looked down at this mountain of a man who had been at death's door and was now returning to the land of the living through sheer, stubborn will and her own careful nursing. Yes, barely. He tried to sit up, winced, settled back against the rolled blanket she had placed under his head. His hand moved instinctively toward where his gun belt would have been. When he found nothing, understanding flickered across his face. "You took my weapons." "I did. They're safe, along with everything else that might be a danger to my children." She had secured his gun belt in the root cellar that first night. The Kentucky rifle, a fine piece that spoke of quality craftsmanship, stood in the corner behind the door. His hunting knife was wrapped in cloth and hidden in the flour barrel. All of it spoke to a man who knew how to live in these mountains, who respected the tools that kept him alive. His eyes found Lily and Daniel. The children had abandoned their pretense of playing and were staring openly at him now, studying this giant who had invaded their small world. How many? 2. And another. Sarah's hand moved to where Grace slept in her cradle, a gesture that had become unconscious over the months. Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or concern, or recognition of a fellow traveler in the hard country of loss. "Where's your husband?" "Dead since spring. Mining accident." Jacob absorbed this information with the stillness of a man who had learned to hold his reactions close, to give nothing away that might be used against him. But Sarah saw it anyway, the flicker of genuine sympathy, the understanding that came from shared grief. "I'm sorry for your loss." There was something in his voice, something that told her he wasn't just being polite, that he knew what those words meant, because he had heard them spoken over his own dead. "I'm obliged to you for your kindness. Name's Jacob. Jacob McAllister." "I know. I found the wanted poster." A pause, long enough to be uncomfortable. His jaw tightened. His eyes went flat and hard. The look of a man preparing for betrayal, for violence, for whatever came next when the person who saved your life discovered you were worth $1,000 dead or alive. "And yet I'm still alive. For now. I haven't decided what to do with you yet." Jacob almost smiled at that. "Fair enough. May I ask your name, ma'am?" "Sarah. Sarah Nighthawk. Redfield before. But my husband's dead, and I'm done pretending to be something I'm not. Apache." It wasn't a question. He said it like he was identifying a type of tree or recognizing the call of a particular bird. Simple observation without judgment. "Mescalero. You got a problem with that?" "No, ma'am. I fought alongside Apache scouts in Texas. Best trackers I ever knew. Best fighters, too, when they had cause." Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. Something small and cautious, like the first green shoot pushing through snow at winter's end. This man, this fugitive, this stranger who had brought danger to her door, was the first white person in 9 months to speak of her Apache blood without disgust or pity or that particular kind of liberal guilt that was somehow worse than honest hatred. "Then you're smarter than most white men." Jacob did smile at that, a real smile that transformed his scarred face into something almost boyish, made him look younger than the hard years had carved him to be. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and relentless. Sarah moved to the window, watching the white curtain descend over the forest. Another storm, another few days trapped inside, with this man, this wanted man, this man she had chosen to save, instead of selling for the price on his head. That night, after the children were asleep, Sarah retrieved Jacob's pack from where she had hidden it. She set it beside him without a word, watched as he opened it with careful hands, as he checked the contents with the thoroughness of someone who had lost too much to take anything for granted. His hand stopped on the oiled cloth package at the bottom. He looked up at her, a question in his eyes. I saw it, the map, with 2 sets of handwriting. Jacob pulled out the package, unwrapped it slowly, spread the map on the floor between them where the firelight could fall across it. Sarah knelt down, looking at what she had only glimpsed before, looking at her dead husband's handwriting next to another hand, more delicate, more precise. A woman's hand. Margaret McAllister. His voice was soft, barely above a whisper. My wife. She was a nurse, tended to miners who got hurt. She started noticing that the injuries weren't random, that men were dying in specific sections of specific mines. Always the same company, always the same pattern. Sarah traced the lines with her finger, following Thomas's additions, seeing where he had marked Section D with those damning words, insufficient supports, warned foreman, told to continue, May 1883, 17 men. The date of the collapse that had killed him and stolen him from her, and left her alone with 2 children and a baby, and the crushing weight of grief. My husband added to this, before he died. He did. They never met. Margaret died 3 years ago, but they were documenting the same thing. Blackwood Mining Company was killing men to save money, cutting costs, ignoring safety, letting workers die and calling it bad luck or God's will or the cost of doing business. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. Not surprise exactly. She had suspected, had read between the lines of Thomas's letters, had heard the worry in his voice the last time he came home. But suspicion and proof were different things. Suspicion could be ignored. Proof demanded action. How did your wife die? Fire, set by men who wanted to silence her, who couldn't find me, so they found her instead, found our children, burned them alive while I was away on business. The kind of business that keeps a man from sleeping easy. His voice was steady, but Sarah could see the cost of the words, could see the way his hands clenched on the map, the way his jaw worked, the way 3 years had done nothing to diminish the grief or the guilt or the rage that came from surviving when the people you loved did not. Is that why you're running? Because you blame yourself? I blame myself because it was my fault. And the men who shot me? They're connected to what happened to Margaret and the children. Part of the same web, the same corruption. Colonel Silas Blackwood wants this map. Wants me dead. Wants anyone who knows the truth silenced permanently. What does he want from you? He wants me to be the man I used to be. Wants me to do work I swore I'd never do again. When I refused, he decided to make an example of me. Make sure everyone knows what happens to people who stand against him. What kind of work? Jacob looked at her directly, his green eyes holding hers without flinching, without trying to hide what he had been or what he had done, or what kind of man sits across from a widow in her home with blood on his hands and ghosts at his back. The kind that leaves families like yours without fathers. The kind that creates widows and orphans. I was an enforcer, a hired gun, a man who solved problems with violence because I was good at it, and it paid well, and I didn't ask too many questions about whose problems I was solving or why. And now? Now I'm trying to figure out how to be something else, how to live with what I've done, how to make sure Margaret and the children didn't die for nothing. Sarah studied his face, seeing past the scars and the beard and the hard shell of a man who had learned to survive in a world that rewarded strength and punished weakness. She saw guilt there, real guilt, the kind that ate at a person from the inside. But she also saw something else, determination, a sense of purpose that came not from righteousness, but from the desperate need to make meaning from meaningless loss. You could leave, draw them away from here. That would be the smart thing. Jacob was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke, his words careful. Each one weighted with the understanding that what he said next would determine whether he lived or died in this cabin, whether Sarah Nighthawk would let him stay or send him back into the snow to freeze or be hunted down by Blackwood's men. What I want and what's right aren't necessarily the same thing. But if you're asking what I want to stay. I want to help you. I want to make sure those men on that map, all 31 of them, including your Thomas and my Margaret, didn't die for nothing. I want to take Blackwood down, and I can't do it alone." Sarah looked at the map, at Thomas's handwriting, at the careful documentation of negligence and greed and corporate murder dressed up as acceptable losses. She thought about the $1,000, about survival, about safety, about all the practical reasons she should send this man away. Then she thought about justice, about the other widows in Glenwood who had been told their husbands died in unavoidable accidents, about the children growing up without fathers because one man valued profit over human life, about the fact that sometimes the safe choice and the right choice were not the same thing at all. "You can stay until you're healed. But Mr. McAllister, if Blackwood's men come looking for you, I need to know exactly what we're facing. I won't have my children endangered by surprises." "You'll have that, ma'am, and more." "What more?" "I'll teach you how to fight, how to defend this place, how to survive if they come, because they will come, and when they do, you'll need to be ready." Sarah held his gaze, seeing in it the reflection of her own determination, her own refusal to run or hide or accept that the world was just hard and cruel and nothing could be done about it. She nodded once, a compact sealed, an alliance formed between two people who had lost everything and refused to lose anything more. Outside the window, 3 sets of footprints circled the cabin in the fresh snow, close enough to see the smoke from the chimney, close enough to count the number of people inside, close enough to report back to Colonel Silas Blackwood that his problem had found shelter, that the map was closer than he thought, and that the widow Sarah Nighthawk had just made the biggest mistake of her life. But Sarah didn't know about the footprints yet, didn't know that she and Jacob had perhaps a day, perhaps 2, before Blackwood's men returned with clear orders and loaded guns. Didn't know that the choice she had just made would lead to gunfire and blood and a trial that would expose corruption reaching higher and deeper than either of them imagined. All she knew was that for the first time in 9 months, she didn't feel alone. For the first time since Thomas died, she felt like she was moving toward something instead of just away from grief. For the first time since the funeral, she felt like maybe, possibly, there was still a reason to fight. Jacob McAllister fell asleep by the fire, his breathing steady and strong, the fever broken, the wound healing. A wanted man resting in the home of an Apache widow who had chosen mercy over money, who had chosen justice over safety, who had chosen to stand and fight instead of bending under the weight of loss. And in the darkness beyond the cabin walls, the men who served Colonel Blackwood watched and waited, planning, calculating, preparing for the violence that would come when mercy and greed finally met in the New Mexico snow. 3 days passed in careful coexistence. Jacob's strength returned with surprising speed, though he moved cautiously, favoring his wounded shoulder. Sarah watched him with the wariness of a mother wolf, cataloging his habits, searching for signs of the danger he claimed to carry. What she found instead was a man who rose before dawn to tend the fire, who moved through her small cabin with deliberate quiet so as not to wake the children, who seemed to find genuine pleasure in small domestic tasks that most men would have scorned. He mended the loose handle on her water bucket without being asked, tightened the hinges on the door that had been sticking since the first hard freeze, crafted a better poker for the fireplace from a piece of scrap iron Thomas had left behind, shaping it with patient hands that suggested years of practice. Small things, practical things, the kind of things that made a difference between merely surviving and actually living. You don't have to earn your keep. Sarah told him this one morning as she watched him carefully measuring flour for breakfast biscuits. His portions were smaller than what she would have served. She realized he was rationing himself, even as he helped prepare the meal. Habit. My mother taught me that idle hands are the devil's workshop. Your mother raised you right. She tried. There was something wistful in his voice, the sound of a man looking back across years that had taken him far from whatever lessons he had learned at his mother's knee. Far from the boy he had been before life and war and violence had carved him into something harder, something that survived but wondered sometimes if survival was enough. The children had begun to orbit around him like curious planets around a distant sun, drawn to his quiet presence but remaining shy, speaking to him in whispers and darting glances. It was Daniel who finally broke the ice. The 6-year-old approached Jacob one afternoon with a question that had apparently been troubling him for days. "Mr. Jacob, do you know how to make things?" Jacob looked up from whittling a new handle for Sarah's worn broom. "What kind of things?" "Fun things. Papa used to make me toys." The boy's voice trailed off. Sarah felt her heart clench at the casual way her son spoke of loss, as if death were just another fact of mountain life, as if the absence of his father was something that could be mentioned in the same breath as the weather or what they might have for supper. "What kind of toys did your papa make?" "Horses and soldiers, and once he made Lily a doll that looked just like Mama." Jacob studied the boy's earnest face. "I could manage a horse, if you've got some wood to spare." Daniel's eyes lit up like lanterns. "Really? Truly, really?" "Truly, but you'll have to help. Can't make a proper horse without the right kind of help." And so began what Sarah would later remember as the gentling of Jacob Bear McAllister. She watched from the kitchen as he guided Daniel's small hands in selecting the right piece of pine, showing him how to feel for the grain, to envision the shape hidden within the wood. His patience seemed inexhaustible, his instructions gentle but precise. "See here," Jacob pointed to a knot in the wood. "That'll be the horse's eye. Always start with the eyes." Lily drifted closer, drawn despite herself, watching as this strange man who lived with them now taught her little brother the same kinds of things their father used to teach. Sarah watched the hardness in her daughter's face begin to soften. Some of the burden that 9 months of being the oldest had carved into her features. Some small opening toward hope. Some of the hardness that 9 months of being the oldest had carved into her features. Some small softening toward hope. But the peace was fragile, broken by moments when Jacob's head would snap up at the sound of wind in the trees or the distant cry of a hunting hawk. His hand would move instinctively toward where his gun should be. His eyes would grow sharp and distant, hard with the knowledge of what was coming, the certainty that violence would find him, because violence always found him, had followed him across 3 states and 2 territories, and would follow him here too if he let his guard down for even a moment. On the 4th night, as they sat by the fire after the children had gone to bed, Sarah finally asked the question that had been building in her mind. "Do you ever sleep?" Jacob looked up from the piece of cedar he was shaping into a bird for Lily. "Some, not much. Bad dreams." "About your family?" "Among other things." Sarah was quiet for a moment, watching the play of firelight across his scarred face, seeing the grief etched deep in the lines around his eyes, the way he held himself, like a man expecting a blow. Thomas used to say that every sunrise was God's way of offering a fresh start, that a man could be anything he chose to be, as long as he was willing to do the work. Your Thomas sounds like he was an optimist. He was, right up until the mountain fell on him. Sarah's voice carried no bitterness, only a kind of weary acceptance. But that doesn't make him wrong. The next afternoon, Jacob's strength had returned enough for him to venture outside the cabin. Sarah watched from the window as he made a slow circuit of their small clearing, his eyes constantly moving, cataloging escape routes and defensive positions with the unconscious thoroughness of a man whose survival had long depended on such calculations. When he returned, he brought with him an armload of deadfall and a grim expression. "We need to talk." His voice was low, his eyes flicking toward where the children played by the fire. Sarah followed him outside, pulling Thomas's coat tight against the bitter air. "What is it?" "Someone's been through here. 3 horses, coming from the east. Tracks are 2 days old, maybe less. Made after the snow stopped, night before last." "You're certain?" Jacob pointed toward a stand of pines that offered a clear view of their cabin. "Snow fell 2 nights ago. These tracks were made yesterday morning after it stopped. See how the edges are still sharp, not melted or filled in. They spent time here, watching from the tree line. They circled around, spent time watching from the tree line. Professional work. They knew what they were doing." "Are they hunting you?" "Most likely." "Why didn't they approach?" "Because I wasn't here to see. They were scouting, gathering information. Next time they come, it won't be to look." Sarah felt ice settle in her stomach, the cold fear of a mother who understands her children are in danger. "How long do we have?" "Hard to say. Could be days, could be weeks. Depends on how badly they want me and how much they know about this place." "And if they come?" Jacob met her eyes directly. "Then we'll be ready for them." But as Sarah settled by the fire for another night of watching and waiting, she couldn't shake the image of those tracks circling her home like a noose drawing tight. The knowledge of being watched, of predators in the darkness just beyond the light, calculating, planning, waiting for the right moment to strike. The stranger in Sarah Nighthawk's cabin was no longer just a man. He was a choice, a risk, and possibly, though she barely dared think it, a chance at something she had thought lost forever. Justice, truth, and maybe in time, redemption for them both. The knowledge of being watched changed everything. Jacob began each day by checking the perimeter, looking for fresh signs, while Sarah started breakfast. The children sensed the shift in mood without understanding its source, growing quieter, more clingy, as the adults around them radiated barely suppressed tension. Jacob threw himself into practical tasks with the urgency of a man preparing for siege. He repaired loose shingles on the cabin's roof, sealing every gap that might let in wind or weather. He reinforced the door with additional planking, crafted shutters for the windows, built a second woodshed closer to the house so they wouldn't have to venture far for fuel. "You're making this place into a fortress," Sarah observed this one afternoon as she watched him dig a new root cellar behind the cabin. "Better to have it and not need it," Jacob replied, pausing to wipe sweat from his forehead despite the cold. His shoulder was healing well, though she could see the careful way he favored it during heavy work. What if they don't come? What if those tracks were just travelers passing through? Jacob leaned on his shovel and looked at her directly. "Mrs. Nighthawk, in my experience, when dangerous men take the time to scout a place, they've got intentions beyond mere curiosity." Sarah's hand moved instinctively to where Grace slept in a sling against her chest, a habit she had developed, keeping the baby close. where she could protect her, where no harm could reach her without going through Sarah first. "There's something else we need to discuss," Jacob said quietly, glancing toward where Lily and Daniel played near the cabin. "If trouble comes, you and the children will need to know what to do." That evening, after the children were asleep, Jacob spread Thomas's old maps on the kitchen table. By lamplight, he traced routes through the mountains, pointing out landmarks and potential shelter. "There's an old trapper's cabin about 5 miles north." His finger followed a thin line that represented a deer trail. "Abandoned for years, but the structure is sound. If things go bad here, that's where you'll take the children." Sarah stared at the map. 5 miles through snow with a 6-year-old while carrying a 7-month-old baby. "Jacob, I couldn't make half that distance." "You could if you had to. People can do remarkable things when their children's lives depend on it." She studied the twisting path he had outlined, trying to memorize every turn. "What about you?" "I'll buy you time to get away. Then I'll handle things the way I know how." Sarah looked up from the map, meeting his eyes, seeing in them the same grim determination she felt building in her own chest. "And if I refuse to run?" Jacob was quiet for a long moment. Then slowly, carefully, he reached across the table and took her hand. His palm was rough with calluses, warm, solid, real. "Then we stand together, and we make them regret coming here." The conversation was interrupted by a soft sound from the children's room, Lily calling out in her sleep. Sarah rose to check on her daughter, finding the 9-year-old tangled in her quilts, murmuring restlessly. She smoothed Lily's hair, straightened her covers, tucked the quilts around her shoulders. Simple mother things, normal things, things that felt desperately precious in the face of coming violence. When she turned, she found Jacob standing in the doorway, watching. There was something raw and vulnerable in his face, the look of a man seeing something he had lost and could never reclaim. "She looks like you. She has her father's stubborn streak. That's not such a bad thing. Stubbornness can keep a person alive when nothing else will." Sarah studied his face, seeing past the scars and the beard to the grief underneath. Jacob. Some conversations are better left for daylight. She meant it kindly, a reprieve, but he shook his head. "No, ma'am. If we're going to stand together, you should know what kind of man you're standing with. Then tell me." My choices happened to them, to Margaret and the children. I was an enforcer for men like Blackwood, did things I'm not proud of, made enemies who couldn't touch me directly, so they touched what I loved instead. Fire, set by men I had crossed, men who knew exactly how to hurt me most. I heard them screaming. In my dreams, I still hear them. His voice broke on the last word. Sarah saw tears on his scarred cheeks. This mountain of a man, this killer, this wanted fugitive, crying in her doorway for the family he couldn't save, for the man he used to be, for all the things that could never be undone or forgiven or made right. She crossed to him, took his hand again, held it between both of hers. "You're not that man anymore." "How do you know?" "Because that man wouldn't have carved toys for my son, wouldn't have taught my daughter to smile again, wouldn't have given me hope when I thought I had none left." Jacob looked at her, really looked, and Sarah saw something shift behind his eyes, some wall coming down, some door opening. The first fragile possibility that maybe redemption wasn't just a word. Maybe it was something real, something that could be earned through small kindnesses and patient work and the daily choice to be better than what you were. The moment stretched between them, waited with all the things neither of them was ready to say. Then Grace cried from the other room, breaking the spell, bringing them back to the present, to the reality of danger circling, of time running out, of decisions that needed to be made. Sarah went to tend to her baby. Jacob returned to his watch by the window. And outside in the darkness, 3 men on horseback moved through the forest. Closer now, following orders, carrying weapons, coming for the map and the man who carried it, and anyone who stood in their way. The peace that had settled over Sarah Nighthawk's cabin was about to shatter. And when it did, blood would soak the New Mexico snow. Justice would demand its price. And 2 broken people would discover whether the bonds forged in crisis could hold against the weight of violence and grief, and the desperate human need to believe that even in darkness, hope could take root and grow. The decision was made at dawn. Sarah would ride to Santa Fe, 60 miles through winter country, to find U.S. Marshal Samuel Grayson, the only lawman Jacob trusted, the only man with the authority and integrity to take on Colonel Silas Blackwood and his empire of corruption. It was dangerous. It was necessary. And Sarah was the only one who could do it. Jacob couldn't show his face in any town. The wanted posters made that impossible. But a widow on horseback, traveling to visit family or conduct business, would raise no suspicion, would pass through checkpoints and settlements without question, could deliver the map and their testimony to someone who might actually give a damn about 31 dead miners and the man who killed them. If you're not back in 2 days, I take the children north to the trapper's cabin. Jacob told her this as he saddled Copper, the brown mare that had carried Thomas through these mountains for 5 years before carrying his widow. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking the cinch, adjusting the stirrups, making sure everything was secure. "I'll be back." Sarah's voice was firm, certain, but Jacob saw the fear underneath. The way her hand kept moving to check the rifle, the way she looked back at the cabin where Lily and Daniel and Grace slept, committing their faces to memory in case this was the last time. "I know you will, but if something happens, if they stop you, you run. You don't fight. You don't try to be a hero. You run back here, and we figure out another way." Sarah swung up into the saddle with the easy grace of someone who had been riding since childhood, who had learned horsemanship from her Apache grandfather and perfected it through years of mountain living. She looked down at Jacob, this man who had stumbled bleeding into her life 2 weeks ago, this wanted fugitive who had become something she couldn't quite name, something more than an obligation, something less than a promise, something that felt dangerously close to hope. "Take care of my children, with my life." She kicked Copper into motion, the mare's hooves crunching through fresh snow. Jacob stood watching until horse and rider disappeared into the tree line. Then he turned back to the cabin, to Lily and Daniel just waking, to Grace needing to be fed, to the long hours of waiting and wondering if Sarah would make it, if Blackwood's men would find her, if this gamble would pay off, or if he had just sent the only good thing in his life straight into danger's teeth. The morning passed slowly. Jacob kept the children occupied, teaching Daniel how to whittle, showing Lily how to read animal tracks in the snow. Practical skills dressed up as games, ways to distract them from their mother's absence, from the tension that radiated off him like heat from a fire. It was just after noon when everything went wrong. Sarah had been riding for 4 hours, making good time despite the snow. The trail to Santa Fe was well-traveled, marked by cairns and blazes, easy enough to follow, even in winter. She was thinking about Marshal Grayson, about what she would say, about how she would convince him to act on the testimony of a wanted man and an Apache widow. Thinking so hard, she almost missed the warning signs. The birds had stopped singing. The forest had gone quiet. Sarah's hand moved to her rifle, just as they stepped out from behind the trees. 2 men on horseback, blocking the trail ahead. She recognized them from Jacob's description. Boone, broad-shouldered and thick-necked like a bull, built for violence. And Cass, tall and lean, with the cold eyes of a snake, the kind of man who enjoyed his work. Mrs. Redfield, out for a ride. Boone's voice was deceptively pleasant, the false kindness of a predator playing with prey. "I'm going to town. Please move aside. Dangerous for a woman in your condition to be traveling alone." Cass urged his horse closer, his gaze moving over her with an assessment that made Sarah's skin crawl, especially on roads where accidents happen. Sarah's fingers closed around the revolver grip. "I said move aside." Boone reached for his gun, and Sarah acted on instinct. She drew Thomas's revolver and fired. The shot went wild, intentionally so, passing close enough to Cass's head that he jerked backward with a startled curse. His horse reared. Cass tumbled from the saddle, landing hard in the snow. The next one won't miss. But Boone was faster than she expected. He spurred his horse forward and swung his arm, knocking the gun from her hand. Sarah tried to keep her seat, but Copper shied, spooked by the gunfire and sudden movement. Sarah felt herself sliding, falling. She managed to twist as she went down, protecting her body, but the impact with the frozen ground drove the air from her lungs. Pain lanced through her side. For a moment she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only lie in the snow, gasping like a landed fish. Copper bolted, disappearing down the trail, leaving Sarah alone with 2 armed men and no way to defend herself. Boone dismounted, standing over her. "Should have stayed home, Mrs. Redfield. Blackwood just wants to talk." Liar. Sarah tried to rise, but Boone put his boot on her shoulder, not pressing, just holding her in place. Cass climbed to his feet, brushing snow from his coat. His face was red with fury. "That crazy witch nearly shot me." "Shut up, Cass." Blackwood said no marks. "We take her back. Let him decide what to do." "The hell with that. She shot at me. I'm going to—" A third voice cut through the argument. "Let her go." Both men turned. Luther Cain stood 20 feet away, his hand on his gun. The red-haired man Sarah had never seen before, didn't know, had no reason to trust. But something in his stance, something in his voice, told her that this moment mattered, that something significant was happening. "Luther." Boone's voice carried genuine confusion. "What are you doing?" "I said let her go." Cass laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "You gone soft, Luther? She's helping McAllister. Blackwood wants them both." "I don't care what Blackwood wants." Luther's hand moved closer to his gun. "I watched Ruth McAllister burn, watched her children die. I didn't stop it then, and it's eaten at me every day since. I won't watch another woman die. Not today." "You're making a mistake." "Maybe, but it's my mistake to make." The confrontation hung balanced on a knife's edge. 3 armed men, each calculating odds and outcomes. Sarah used the moment to roll away from Boone's boot. Scrambling behind a fallen log, her hand found a rock. Not much of a weapon, but better than nothing. Cass made the decision for all of them. He drew his gun. Luther was faster. The shot echoed through the hollow like thunder. Cass stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder, his weapon falling into the snow. He stared at Luther with disbelief, with betrayal, with the shocked understanding that the rules had just changed, that loyalty meant nothing, that violence had turned inward. "Go!" Luther shouted at Sarah. "Get back to the cabin. Warn McAllister. Blackwood's coming tonight with 10 men." Sarah didn't need to be told twice. She ran, stumbling through the snow, following the trail Copper had broken. Behind her, she heard more gunshots, men shouting, the sounds of violence she didn't stay to witness. She ran until her lungs burned, until her legs trembled, until she saw Copper standing by the trail, calm now, waiting. Sarah caught the mare's reins, hauled herself into the saddle, kicked Copper into a gallop. The miles blurred past, trees and snow and the desperate need to get home, to warn Jacob, to save her children, to prepare for the violence that was coming, whether they were ready or not. She reached the cabin as the sun touched the western peaks. Jacob was outside chopping wood. He saw her coming, saw something in her face, dropped the axe and ran to meet her. Sarah nearly fell from the saddle. Jacob caught her, held her steady. What happened? Ambush. Boone and Cass. Luther shot Cass. Saved me. Told me to warn you. Blackwood's coming tonight. 10 men. Jacob's face went still in that way Sarah had learned meant he was thinking fast and hard. How long ago? Maybe 4 hours. Then we have until dark. Maybe less. He helped her down, led her toward the cabin. Sarah's legs shook, adrenaline draining away and leaving exhaustion in its wake. But there was no time for rest, no time for fear, only preparation. We need to get the children away from here. No time. Sarah shook her head. They could be an hour behind me or 10 minutes. We stay. We fight. Sarah, you're exhausted. You can barely stand. Which is why running isn't an option. She met his eyes, seeing her own determination reflected back. We've run far enough, Jacob. Both of us. It ends here. For a moment, she thought he would argue. Then something shifted in his expression, a kind of grim acceptance. All right, then. We do this smart. He called Lily and Daniel, knelt before them, speaking with calm authority, despite the urgency hammering in his chest. Listen carefully. Bad men are coming. When you hear 3 whistles from me, you run to the cave like we practiced. You stay there until Mama or I come to get you. No matter what you hear, no matter how scared you get, you stay hidden and quiet. Trust? Both children nodded, eyes wide but trusting. They had practiced this, knew what to do. Small mercies in a world suddenly gone dangerous. Can you do that for me? Yes, sir, Lily whispered, taking Daniel's hand, their faces pale but determined. Good girl. Now go pack a blanket and some food, just in case. As the children scurried to obey, a new sound reached them. Hoofbeats, coming fast. Jacob grabbed his rifle. Sarah reached for her revolver. Both of them ready for violence, ready for whatever came next. But it wasn't Blackwood's men. An old man on horseback emerged from the tree line. Apache, 70 years if he was a day. Long white hair hanging past his shoulders, face lined with age, but eyes sharp as broken glass. He sat his horse with the ease of someone who had been riding since before Sarah was born. Grandfather, Sarah's voice broke. Red Skywalker. The elder who had raised her after her parents died, who had taught her tracking and healing and the old ways that most people had forgotten or chosen to ignore. She hadn't seen him in 2 years, since Thomas's funeral, since the day he told her that the spirits would guide her when she needed them most. I dreamed you were in danger, granddaughter. The spirits of your ancestors sent me. Jacob stepped forward, rifle lowered but ready, his posture respectful despite the urgency. Sir. Red Sky studied Jacob with those sharp eyes, seeing past the scars and the beard to something deeper. The Mountain Man. I saw you in my dream. You will protect my granddaughter. Yes, sir, with my life. The old man nodded, as if this was settled, as if he had ridden 12 miles through winter country just to confirm what his dreams had already told him. He dismounted with surprising grace for his age. The children must come with me, to my village. They will be safe there. Sarah felt tears sting her eyes, the relief so intense it was almost painful. Lily, Daniel, Grace, safe, protected, away from the violence about to descend on this place like a storm. Thank you. Red Skywalker placed his weathered hand on Sarah's head, speaking in Apache, words of blessing and protection, words that connected her to generations of warriors and healers, to a people who had survived worse than Colonel Blackwood and his hired guns, who had endured and persisted and refused to be erased. He helped gather the children, lifted Grace into a sling across his chest with the practiced ease of someone who had carried many babies, put Lily and Daniel on his horse, looked at Sarah one last time. May the spirits of your ancestors walk with you. Then he was gone, taking with him the 3 most precious things in Sarah's world, leaving her and Jacob alone in the cabin, waiting for nightfall, waiting for violence, waiting for the moment when mercy and greed would finally collide. They spent the remaining hours preparing. Jacob positioned weapons around the cabin, ammunition, water, bandages. He showed Sarah the best firing positions, the angles that would give them the most coverage. If they rush us, fall back to the bedroom. It's got the strongest door. Sarah checked Thomas's rifle, her hands steadier now. And if they try to burn us out? Then we go through the back window and run for the cave with the children. Except the children were safe now, miles away, protected by Red Skywalker and the Apache community that would defend them as their own. Small mercy in the face of coming darkness. They're going to kill us, Sarah said it quietly. Matter of fact, not a question, just acknowledgement of reality. They're going to try. Jacob looked at her. This woman who had saved his life, who had given him purpose when he thought he had none, who had taught him that redemption wasn't just a word, but something real, something that could be earned through daily choices and patient work, and the willingness to stand for what was right, even when it cost everything. I'm glad I fell bleeding into your life. Sarah smiled despite everything, smiled despite the fear and the exhaustion and the certainty of violence coming. I'm glad I didn't leave you in the snow. As darkness fell, they took their positions, Sarah at the north window, Jacob at the south, both watching, both waiting, both ready for whatever came next. The silence stretched. Minutes became an hour, the cabin warm and light in the gathering dark. A small island of safety in a world gone cold and dangerous. Sarah thought about Thomas, about the man who had loved her despite her Apache blood, who had given her children and a home and 7 years of happiness before the mountain took him. She thought about Jacob, about the scarred and broken man who had stumbled into her life and somehow made it better, made her believe in second chances, in the possibility of healing, in the stubborn human capacity to hope, even in the darkest of winters. Then they came. 6 horsemen emerged from the tree line, moving slowly, deliberately, spreading out to surround the cabin. In the center, mounted on a white horse, sat a man in an expensive black coat. Even from a distance, Sarah could see the quality of it, the careful tailoring, the wealth and power it represented. Colonel Silas Blackwood had come to collect his debts. His voice carried through the cold air, cultured, cold, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "McAllister, I know you're in there. Surrender yourself and the woman. This doesn't have to end in violence." Jacob moved to the door, opened it a crack. "You mean it doesn't have to end with you bleeding? We both know you'll kill us regardless." "Not necessarily. Give me the map. Give me the evidence. Walk away and live." "Can't do that, Colonel. Too many dead already. Ruth, Thomas Redfield, 29 others whose names you probably don't even remember. It ends tonight." There was a pause, then Blackwood's voice again. All pretense of civility dropped. "Burn them out." Sarah saw the torches lit, saw two men ride forward, firebrands held high. Jacob fired twice. One torch fell, its bearer crying out, tumbling from his horse. The other torch arced through the air, landing on the cabin roof with a shower of sparks. The smell of smoke reached Sarah almost immediately. She heard Jacob shout, heard his 3 sharp whistles, the signal. Except the children were already safe, already miles away. The whistles meant nothing now except acknowledgement, except goodbye, except here we stand, and here we fight, and here we die, if that's what it takes. Sarah fired through the window, her shot going wide but forcing the attackers back, buying seconds. Jacob reloaded, fired again, professional, methodical, making each bullet count. But there were too many, and the fire was spreading fast. "We have to go." Jacob's voice cut through the chaos. Sarah grabbed the map, shoved it inside her coat. They moved toward the back door, toward escape, toward the slim chance of survival. Behind them, the cabin burned. Everything Thomas had built, everything they had tried to protect. They burst through the back door into cold, clean air. Sarah gasped, coughing, her eyes streaming. Jacob pulled her toward the forest, toward safety, toward the cave where they could regroup, where they could... A figure stepped out of the darkness ahead of them. Colonel Silas Blackwood, immaculate in his expensive coat, a pistol in his hand. He had circled around, anticipated their escape, positioned himself perfectly to end this, to silence them forever, to bury the truth along with the witnesses. Going somewhere? For a moment the 3 of them stood frozen, Jacob and Sarah on one side, Blackwood on the other. 10 feet of snow stained orange by the burning cabin. The moment stretched, weighted with violence about to break, with lives hanging in the balance, with justice delayed but not denied. Then another sound reached them, hoofbeats, many of them, and voices calling out with authority, "U.S. Marshal, hold your fire!" Marshal Samuel Grayson appeared through the smoke and darkness, leading 12 deputies, rifles drawn, surrounding the scene with the swift efficiency of lawmen who knew their business. His eyes took in everything, the burning cabin, the armed men, Blackwood with his pistol, Sarah and Jacob caught between. "Colonel Blackwood, lower your weapon." Blackwood's face transformed, the mask of cold calculation slipping, replaced by something almost charming, almost convincing. "Marshal Grayson, thank God you're here. These criminals attacked my men. I was defending myself." "That's interesting," Grayson replied, his tone suggesting he found it anything but. "Because I received a telegram 3 days ago from the territorial governor's office. Something about investigating certain irregularities at Blackwood Mining Company. Something about a man named Jacob McAllister being wrongly accused." "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do." Grayson dismounted, his deputies following suit, surrounding Blackwood's men with practiced precision. "I also received a visit this afternoon from a very determined young man, wounded, barely able to sit a horse, but insistent that I ride here before Colonel Blackwood silenced his witnesses." Luther Cain appeared, bandaged, pale, but alive. Sitting behind one of the deputies, his eyes met Sarah's across the clearing, a question in them, an apology, a hope for forgiveness that he knew he didn't deserve, but needed anyway. Blackwood's composure was cracking. "This is ridiculous, Marshal. I am a respected businessman. These are wanted criminals and trespassers. I have every right to defend my interests." "Your interests?" Sarah stepped forward, Jacob's hand on her arm, warning, but she shook it off. "Is that what you call 31 dead men? Interests?" "Mrs. Redfield," Blackwood's voice dripped false sympathy, "I understand you're grieving your husband, but Thomas died in an unfortunate accident. Mining is dangerous work." "It wasn't an accident." Sarah's voice rose, fueled by 9 months of suppressed rage and grief. "You knew those support beams were rotted. You knew the ventilation was inadequate. Thomas wrote about it. He warned your foreman, and your foreman told him to work anyway or lose his job." "Hearsay and speculation." "I have his letters, every one of them, documenting the unsafe conditions, documenting the threats." Sarah reached into her coat, pulled out the bundle of papers she had carried since Thomas died. The letters she had read 100 times. The proof she had kept close to her heart, waiting for this moment. "And I have the map. Ruth McAllister documented every unsafe section of your mining operation. My husband added to it before he died." Together they prove a pattern. 29 deaths over 3 years. All preventable, all for profit. Grayson took the letters, scanning them by the light of the burning cabin. His face grew harder with each page. Deputy Collins. Place Colonel Blackwood under arrest. On what charge? Blackwood's veneer finally shattered completely, revealing the cold fury beneath. For now? Attempted murder, arson, assault with intent to kill a federal officer. Grayson nodded toward Jacob. Sheriff McAllister's commission was never actually revoked. The wanted posters were forgeries, as I confirmed with the Tennessee Territorial Office, which means any attack on him is an attack on a lawful officer of the court. 2 deputies moved toward Blackwood. The colonel's remaining men, seeing their employer about to be arrested, made the calculation that loyalty had its limits. They lowered their weapons. Blackwood was still sputtering protests as the manacles closed around his wrists. "This is a travesty." "I'll have your badge, Grayson. I have friends in Washington, powerful friends." "Then I suggest you have them hire you a good lawyer. You're going to need one." As the deputies led Blackwood away, Sarah felt her knees buckle. The adrenaline that had kept her upright through the ambush and the siege suddenly evaporated, leaving her shaking and weak. Jacob caught her, his arm around her waist, solid, real, alive. "Easy. I've got you." "The children," Sarah gasped. "I need to get to the children." "They're safe. Red Sky took them. Remember?" And Sarah did remember. Through the haze of exhaustion and shock, her children were safe, miles away with her grandfather, protected, alive. The most important thing, the only thing that truly mattered. She looked at the burning cabin, at everything Thomas had built, going up in smoke, at the life she had tried so hard to preserve, dissolving into ash and memory. But strangely, she felt no grief, only a kind of fierce satisfaction. It's just wood and nails. My family is what matters. Grayson approached, removing his hat. I'm sorry about your home, Mrs. Redfield. Sarah watched the flames. Don't be. We'll build another. Better. Stronger. A place where we can start again. She looked at Jacob, at the man who had stumbled, bleeding into her life 3 weeks ago, who had given her purpose when she thought she had none, who had taught her that mercy and justice were not opposing forces, but complementary truths, that redemption was possible, that love could grow even in the coldest winter, if you were brave enough to let it. Together. She said it quietly, but Jacob heard. He pulled her closer, his scarred face transformed by something that looked almost like hope. Together, he agreed, and in that word, Sarah heard a promise, a future, a possibility that the worst might be over and the best might be yet to come. The night after the siege, Sarah and Jacob found shelter at the home of Elena Martinez, a widow herself, 61 years old, with kind eyes and hands that never stopped moving. Cooking, cleaning, caring for people because that was what you did when your neighbors needed help. She took one look at them, covered in soot and exhaustion, and simply opened her door. Come in, both of you. There's hot water for washing, and beds enough for sleeping. Sarah had never been more grateful for simple kindness, for clean water and soap, for a bed that wasn't the cold ground, for a place to close her eyes without wondering if she would wake to violence. Jacob took the small room at the back, Sarah the one near the kitchen, where she could hear if Grace cried. Except Grace wasn't there. Grace was safe with Red Skywalker, with Lily and Daniel, miles away in the Apache village where Blackwood's reach couldn't extend. Sarah lay in the darkness, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of someone else's home, the creak of floorboards, the whisper of wind through gaps in the walls, the distant sound of Jacob pacing in his room, unable to sleep, still wired from the fight, still scanning shadows for threats that might never come. Old habits carved too deep by years of running to fade in a single night of safety. She should sleep, should rest, but her mind kept replaying the night. The fire, the gunshots, Blackwood's face when the marshal arrested him, Luther Cain bleeding but alive, having made the choice that mattered, having finally found the courage to do what was right, even when it cost him everything. Morning came with pale light and the smell of coffee. Elena had breakfast ready before Sarah was fully awake. Tortillas and beans and strong black coffee that cut through the fog of exhaustion. Jacob appeared looking like he had slept even less than Sarah, but his eyes were clear, alert, ready for whatever came next. Marshal Grayson arrived as they were finishing. He carried papers, official documents with seals and signatures, the weight of law and justice made tangible. The trial starts in 3 days. Santa Fe Federal Court. I'll need both of you to testify. Jacob nodded. We'll be there. Grayson's eyes moved to Sarah. Mrs. Redfield, I know this is difficult, but your testimony about the letters, about what Thomas documented, that's crucial to the case. I'll testify. Sarah's voice was steady, determined. My husband died because of Blackwood. 29 other men died. Their families deserve justice. You'll get it, Grayson promised. Federal judges don't waste time when the evidence is this clear. 2 days later, Red Skywalker brought the children back. Sarah heard them before she saw them. Lily's voice calling, Daniel's excited chatter, Grace's baby sounds. She ran outside and they crashed into her, all three of them, a tangle of arms and relief and the overwhelming gratitude of a mother who had sent her children into danger and gotten them back whole. "Mama!" Lily held on tight, her face buried in Sarah's shoulder. "We were so scared." "I know, baby. I know. But you were so brave. So very brave." Daniel pulled back enough to look up at Jacob. Standing in the doorway, watching with that expression he got, the one that said he was remembering other children, other moments, other losses that could never be reclaimed. "Did you win, Mr. Jacob?" "We did." Jacob knelt down, meeting the boy's eyes. "The bad men are in jail. You're safe now." Red Skywalker stood beside his horse, watching, his weathered face showing approval. "You fought well, granddaughter. Your ancestors are pleased." "Thank you, grandfather, for everything." The old man nodded, mounted his horse with surprising grace, began to ride away, then paused, looked back. "The mountain man," he called to Jacob. "You have proven worthy. Care for my family well." "I will, sir, with everything I have." Red Skywalker rode into the forest, disappearing like smoke, like a spirit from the old stories, leaving behind the living to sort out their future without his guidance or blessing, beyond what he had already given. The journey to Santa Fe took 2 days. Sarah and Jacob rode with the children, staying at way stations, sleeping in shifts, still cautious, still watching for danger, even though Blackwood was in custody and his men scattered or arrested. Old habits, hard to break. The lessons that kept you alive when the world was trying to kill you. Santa Fe rose before them on the 3rd day, a city of adobe and wood, of churches and cantinas and the federal court building that stood at its heart. The place where justice, if it existed at all, would finally be served. The courthouse was smaller than Sarah expected, wood-paneled and solemn, with high windows that let in bars of dusty sunlight. Judge Harrison Caldwell presided, 65 years old, with white hair and spectacles. The kind of man who had seen everything and been impressed by nothing. Who cared only about the law and the truth, and whether the evidence supported the charges. Colonel Blackwood sat at the defendant's table, still wearing his expensive clothes, though they looked less impressive now, wrinkled, stained. The patina of wealth and power diminished by 3 days in a jail cell. His lawyer, Victor Sterling, was everything you would expect, slick, confident, the kind of man who could argue black was white and make half the jury believe him. But the prosecution had something Sterling didn't. They had the truth. Prosecutor James Harlow stood to present the opening statement. He was 45, serious, a career lawman who believed that some cases mattered more than others, that some fights were worth having, even when the odds were long and the opposition well-funded. Gentlemen of the jury, we will show you a map. We will present testimony from witnesses. We will provide medical records and mine inspection reports. And when we are done, you will understand that 31 men died, not from accidents, but from corporate negligence, from greed, from the deliberate choice to value profit over human life. Sterling rose smoothly. Your Honor, My client is a respected businessman. These charges are based on evidence from people with personal grudges: a wanted fugitive, a grieving widow, a turncoat employee trying to save his own skin. The defense will show that Colonel Blackwood ran his company within all legal requirements, that accidents, while tragic, are an unavoidable part of mining, that my client is being scapegoated for circumstances beyond his control. The battle lines were drawn. Jacob was called to testify first. He walked to the witness stand with the careful control of a man who knew every eye in the room was on him, judging, calculating, wondering if the mountain man with scars and a checkered past could be trusted, if his testimony had value, or if Sterling would tear him apart on cross-examination. State your name for the record. Jacob Bear McAllister. Mr. McAllister. Harlow's voice was gentle, respectful. Tell the court about your wife. Jacob was quiet for a moment. Sarah saw his hands clench on the rail of the witness box, saw the cost of what came next written in every line of his body. Margaret was a nurse. She tended miners who got hurt working for Blackwood Mining Company. She started noticing patterns: men dying in the same sections, the same types of injuries. She began documenting it, keeping records, trying to understand why good men kept dying in accidents that seemed preventable. What did she discover? That the accidents weren't accidents, that Blackwood was cutting costs, using rotted support beams, inadequate ventilation, forcing men to work in conditions he knew were dangerous, because fixing the problems cost money. And what happened when Colonel Blackwood discovered what your wife was doing? Jacob's voice went flat, hard. He threatened her, told her to stop. When she wouldn't, he had my house burned, with Margaret and my children inside. I was away, working. When I came home, there was nothing left but ashes and bodies. The courtroom was silent. Even Sterling seemed to recognize that some moments couldn't be attacked, that some grief was too raw to be dismissed as manipulation or theatrics. Objection! Sterling stood slowly. There's no evidence Colonel Blackwood ordered any such thing. We have a witness who will testify to exactly that, Harlow replied calmly. Luther Cain, who was present, and will confirm that Colonel Blackwood personally ordered the fire. The afternoon brought Luther to the stand. He looked diminished somehow, thinner, older, the weight of conscience visible in the slump of his shoulders, in the way he couldn't quite meet anyone's eyes as he swore to tell the truth. The whole truth, nothing but the truth. Mr. Cain, you worked for Colonel Blackwood? I did, for 8 years. In what capacity? I was an enforcer, did whatever needed doing, whatever the boss wanted done. And on the night of March 15th, 1880, where were you? Luther's voice cracked. At the McAllister house, watching it burn. Why were you there? Because Blackwood ordered it. He said Margaret McAllister knew too much, that she had to be silenced. He told us to make it look like an accident, to make sure no one survived to tell what they knew. Sterling jumped up. Objection! This witness is facing charges himself. He's testifying to save his own skin. I am. Luther looked directly at Sterling, at the jury, at Jacob sitting in the gallery. I am trying to save myself, but everything I'm saying is true. I watched that house burn. I heard them screaming, Margaret and the children, and I did nothing. I've lived with that for 3 years. I won't live with it anymore. Tears ran down his face, real tears, the kind that couldn't be faked, the kind that came from genuine remorse. from the soul deep understanding that some sins couldn't be washed away, but could at least be confessed, could at least be witnessed and acknowledged, even if they could never be forgiven. Judge Caldwell watched Luther for a long moment, then spoke. "The witness's testimony is on the record. The jury will consider it as they see fit." The next day brought Sarah to the stand. She wore her best dress, simple but clean, her hair pulled back, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. She had faced down armed men, had chosen mercy over money, had stood her ground when running would have been easier. But sitting in front of all these strangers, having to speak about Thomas, about his death, about the letters she had treasured and hated in equal measure, that was harder somehow. "Mrs. Redfield, tell us about your husband." "Thomas was a good man."
Sarah's voice was soft but steady. "He loved his work, loved providing for his family. But he started writing to me about concerns, about support beams that were rotted, about ventilation that wasn't adequate, about the foreman pressuring them to work faster, to dig deeper, to ignore the warning signs. Did he report these concerns? He did, multiple times. The foreman told him to work or find another job. There weren't other jobs, not for a man with a family to feed. So Thomas kept working, kept documenting, kept hoping someone would listen before it was too late. Harlow produced the letters, entered them as evidence, had Sarah identify her husband's handwriting, the dates, the careful documentation of each unsafe condition, each warning ignored, each life put at risk for the sake of quarterly profits. "Mrs. Redfield," the prosecutor's voice was gentle. "In your own words, what happened on May 15th, 1883? Sarah took a breath, held it, let it out slowly.
"The way you did when the pain was too much, and breathing was the only thing keeping you from breaking." "The mine collapsed. Section D. 17 men died, including my husband. Blackwood Mining said it was an accident, an act of God, something that couldn't have been prevented. But Thomas had documented that section, had warned it was unsafe, had begged them to add supports. They told him to keep working." She looked directly at Blackwood, meeting his eyes, refusing to look away. "Your company killed my husband, killed 16 other men, and you called it acceptable losses." The courtroom erupted. Judge Caldwell's gavel cracked like thunder. "Order! We will have order!" But the damage was done. The truth was spoken, and no amount of legal maneuvering could put it back in the box. Sterling tried anyway. On cross-examination, he was aggressive, attacking, suggesting Sarah was a grieving widow who wanted someone to blame,
That her testimony was colored by loss and anger and the very human need to make sense of tragedy. "Mrs. Redfield, isn't it possible your husband was simply wrong? That the mine was as safe as it could be, given the circumstances? That sometimes accidents happen, despite everyone's best efforts?" Sarah looked at him. This man with his expensive suit and smooth words. This man who was paid to defend the indefensible, to make villains look like victims, to convince 12 men that profit mattered more than life. "My husband was a careful man, Mr. Sterling. He knew mines, knew when something wasn't right, and everything he documented was confirmed by your client's own mine inspector. The report is in the evidence. Section D was unsafe. Blackwood knew it, and he chose to keep it open anyway." Sterling had no response to that, sat down, let her go. Sarah walked back to her seat beside Jacob, felt his hand close over hers,
felt the solid warmth of him.
The promise that whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. The trial lasted 3 more days. Expert witnesses, mine engineers, safety inspectors, each one adding another layer of proof, another piece of evidence, another nail in the coffin of Blackwood's defense. By the end, even Sterling looked defeated, like a man going through motions he knew were pointless, fighting a battle already lost. The jury deliberated for 2 hours. When they returned, every face was grim, resolved. The foreman stood, an older man, a blacksmith by trade, the kind of person who understood hard work and fair pay, and the difference between acceptable risk and criminal negligence. On the charge of 31 counts of manslaughter, how do you find? A pause. The weight of 31 lives hanging in the balance. The hope of just as many families waiting for someone to acknowledge their loss. To say out loud that their husbands and fathers and sons had mattered. That their deaths meant something. We find the defendant guilty. The courtroom exploded. Widows weeping, men shouting. Judge Caldwell's gavel working overtime to restore some semblance of order. Sarah felt tears on her face, felt Jacob's arm around her shoulders, felt something break loose inside her chest, some knot of grief and rage and desperate hope finally beginning to unravel. Blackwood stood, face pale, hands shaking. "This is outrageous. I'll appeal. I have rights." "You have the right to remain silent." Judge Caldwell's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "The sentence is 40 years in federal prison, no possibility of parole. All assets of Blackwood Mining Company to be seized and liquidated. Proceeds to be distributed to the families of the deceased. You will spend the rest of your life in a cell, Colonel, and perhaps in that time you will learn the value of the lives you threw away." Deputies moved forward, led Blackwood away. He was still protesting, still insisting this wasn't justice, wasn't fair, wasn't what he deserved. But his voice faded as they took him through the door, down the hall, away to a future of iron bars and gray walls, and the slow grinding understanding that some debts could never be paid. Some sins could never be absolved. Some choices carried consequences that lasted lifetimes. Outside the courthouse, Sarah stood with Jacob and the children, the New Mexico sun warm on her face despite the winter cold. Around them, families gathered, widows, orphans, people who had lost fathers and husbands and sons to Blackwood's greed, people who finally had been heard, had been believed, had been given the justice system's acknowledgement that their losses mattered. Marshal Grayson approached, removing his hat. "Mrs. Redfield, Sheriff McAllister, I wanted to thank you. What you did, standing up like that, it matters." "We did what was necessary." Jacob's voice was quiet, humble. "What anyone should do, but most people don't." Grayson extended his hand. "The territorial governor wants to see you both. There's talk of establishing a mining safety commission, making sure this never happens again. They want someone to head it who understands what's at stake." Jacob glanced at Sarah. She saw the question in his eyes, the possibility, the chance to turn their suffering into something meaningful, to make sure Margaret and Thomas and all the others hadn't died in vain. But she also saw the hesitation, the mountain man in him that wanted peace, wanted quiet, wanted to build a life instead of fighting battles. And she understood because she felt it too. The exhaustion, the desire to simply rest, to let someone else carry the weight for a while. "Tell the governor we're honored," Sarah spoke up. "But right now we need to go home. Need to rebuild. Need to give our children the stability they deserve. Maybe someday we can do more. But not yet. Not now. Grayson nodded, understanding. I'll let him know. But if you change your mind, the offer stands. He tipped his hat, walked away, leaving Sarah and Jacob and the children standing in the fading afternoon light. The trial was over. Justice had been served. And now came the hard part, the part where they figured out how to live with their victories and their losses, how to build something new from the ashes of everything that had burned. Thomas Patrick. Daniel pointed at the courthouse steps. Who's that? Luther Cain sat alone on the stone, hands in chains, waiting for transport to whatever prison would hold him for the next decade. He looked up as they approached, his eyes meeting Sarah's, then Jacob's, holding there, a question, an apology, a hope for something he knew he didn't deserve. Jacob walked over, extended his hand through the gap between the chains. Luther stared at it, then slowly, carefully, took it. You can't bring them back. Jacob's voice was low, meant only for Luther's ears, but Sarah heard anyway. My wife, my children, all the others. You can't undo what was done, but you made a choice when it mattered. You saved Sarah, gave us the chance to bring Blackwood down. That means something. Not enough. No. Jacob agreed. Not enough. But it's something. It's a start. He released Luther's hand, stepped back, and Sarah saw something pass between them. Not forgiveness exactly. That would take years if it came at all. But acknowledgement, understanding, the recognition that people were complicated, that redemption was possible even for those who had done terrible things, that sometimes the best you could hope for was to be slightly better today than you were yesterday. The deputies came, led Luther away. He looked back once, nodded, then was gone. Sarah took Jacob's hand, felt his fingers interlace with hers, solid, real, present. They had survived, had fought for justice, and won. And now they had to figure out what came next, how to live, how to heal, how to build a future worthy of all the people they had lost along the way. But that was tomorrow's problem. Today, they were alive, together, with 3 children who needed feeding, and a home that needed building, and a life that needed living. And sometimes, in the hard country of the New Mexico mountains, that was enough. That was everything. That was all anyone could ask for. Justice for the dead, hope for the living, and the stubborn faith that even in the darkest winter, spring would eventually come. 2 weeks after the trial, Sarah and Jacob returned to what remained of their cabin. The ruins stood like a monument to violence survived. Blackened timbers, collapsed walls. The stone chimney Thomas had built, still standing, defiant, refusing to fall even when everything around it had burned. Sarah stood looking at it for a long time, remembering the man who had laid each stone with his own hands, the life they had tried to build here, the dreams that had gone up in smoke. We'll rebuild. Jacob's voice was quiet, certain, better than before, stronger. Sarah turned to look at him, this man who had stumbled bleeding into her life 6 weeks ago, who had become something she couldn't have imagined that first morning when she found him half frozen in the snow. Partner, protector, friend, and possibly, though neither of them had spoken it aloud yet, something more. We'll need help. We'll have it. He was right. The next morning,
Reverend John Abernathy arrived from Glenwood. Behind him came 15 men on horseback. Farmers, miners, craftsmen, men who had lost fathers and brothers and friends to Blackwood's greed, who had watched Sarah and Jacob stand up in court and tell the truth when it would have been easier to stay silent, who understood that community meant more than just living near each other. It meant standing together when it mattered most. Mrs. Redfield, the Reverend dismounted, removed his hat. "We've come to help you build."
Sarah felt tears sting her eyes. "You don't have to do this. We know. But we want to. You gave our families justice. Let us give you a home." And so they worked. For 10 days the clearing rang with the sounds of construction. Axes biting into wood, saws cutting lumber, hammers driving nails, men calling to each other in the shorthand of those who had worked together all their lives, who knew without asking when someone needed help or when to step back and let a man work through his grief with his hands. Jacob worked alongside them, his wounded shoulder healed enough now for heavy labor. Sarah watched him from the kitchen they had set up under a tarp, cooking for the workers, feeding them the way women had always fed the men who helped raise barns and build homes and create the structures that made life in hard country possible. Lily and Daniel helped where they could, fetching tools, carrying water, learning the rhythms of communal work, the way people came together to lift what no one could lift alone. Grace slept in her cradle, watched over by the older women who had come with their husbands, who sat sewing and mending and telling stories, while their hands stayed busy and their eyes stayed watchful. The new cabin rose from the ashes of the old. 3 bedrooms instead of 2. A proper kitchen with a cast-iron stove donated by Elena Martinez. A stone fireplace built by the Mason brothers, using the stones from Thomas's chimney as a foundation, honoring what had been while creating something new, better, stronger. On the 11th day, they finished. Sarah stood in her new home, feeling the first stirrings of peace in her chest. Not quite healing, not yet, but the beginning of it. The first tentative belief that maybe life could continue, that loss didn't have to be the end, that from ashes and grief and stubborn hope, something good could still grow. That evening the community gathered in the new cabin. Reverend Abernathy offered a blessing, asking God to watch over this house and the people who would live in it, to protect them from harm and fill their days with peace. Sarah listened with her head bowed, Jacob beside her, their hands not quite touching, but close enough that she could feel his warmth, his presence, the solid reality of him. When the blessing was done, the Reverend turned to Sarah. "There's one more thing. We've been collecting donations. Money from the settlement, from Blackwood's seized assets distributed to the families. We want you to have this." He handed her an envelope. Sarah opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was more money than she had seen in years, enough to buy supplies for winter, seeds for planting, everything they would need to not just survive, but actually live. "I can't accept this." "You can." The Reverend's voice was firm, kind. "Your testimony helped all of us get compensation. This is just a small part of what the court awarded. You earned it. Thomas earned it. Take it and use it to give your children the life they deserve." Sarah looked around at the faces gathered in her home, saw understanding there, solidarity, the bone-deep knowledge that they had all lost something, all suffered. And the only way through was together, supporting each other, refusing to let Blackwood's evil be the last word. Thank you, all of you. I don't know how to repay this kindness. Live well. That's repayment enough. As the community dispersed into the cold evening, Jacob stayed behind, helping Sarah settle the children, banking the fire. The domestic rituals of people who had learned to live under one roof, who moved around each other with the careful choreography of those still learning each other's rhythms, but willing to do the work. When the children were asleep, they sat by the fire, the new hearth already taking on the patina of use, of life being lived within its walls. Sarah watched the flames dance, thinking about Thomas, about the man she had loved and lost, about the life they had tried to build together. "You're thinking about him." Jacob's voice was soft, observational rather than accusatory. Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "That's good. You should remember him. Honor what you had." He paused, then continued. "Margaret used to say that hearts don't have finite space, that loving one person doesn't mean you can't love another, that grief and joy can exist side by side if you're brave enough to let them." Sarah looked at him, really looked, at the scars and the gray in his beard, and the weight of his own losses carried in the set of his shoulders, at this man who understood what it meant to love and lose, and wonder if you could ever risk feeling that much again. "Is that what you want, Jacob? To try loving again?" "I think I already am." The words hung between them, simple, honest, terrifying in their implications. Sarah felt her heart hammer against her ribs, felt something in her chest that had been frozen since Thomas died begin to thaw, slowly, painfully, the way ice cracks when spring finally comes. "I'm scared." "I know. Me too." Jacob reached across the space between them, took her hand, his palm rough against hers, solid, real, present in a way that made her believe maybe this was possible. Maybe two broken people could find something whole together if they were patient enough, brave enough, willing to honor what they had lost while building toward what they might have. "We don't have to decide everything tonight. We can take our time, figure it out as we go." Sarah nodded, squeezed his hand, let herself believe that maybe he was right, that maybe the future didn't have to be decided all at once, that maybe it was enough to simply be here, now, together, learning to live again. 3 months passed. Winter gave way to the first hints of spring, snow melting in the hollows, green shoots pushing through the hard ground, the world slowly coming back to life after its long sleep. The cabin settled into routines, rhythms, the patterns of family life that transformed a house into a home. Jacob took his oath as sheriff, standing in the Glenwood courthouse with his hand on a Bible, swearing to uphold the law and protect the people of the northern New Mexico Territory. Marshal Grayson pinned the badge to his chest, the silver star gleaming in the morning light, a symbol of authority reclaimed, of purpose restored, of a man given a second chance to be what he had always wanted to be beneath the violence and the running, someone who protected instead of destroyed. Sarah opened a small school in the cabin's largest room, teaching not just her own children, but 5 others from neighboring families, reading and arithmetic, and the skills that would help them build better lives than their parents had known. She taught them Apache tracking, too, and the names of plants that could heal, and the old stories Red Skywalker had taught her, weaving together 2 worlds, 2 traditions, creating something new from the synthesis. In April, Reverend Abernathy came calling. He found Sarah in the garden, planting seeds in neat rows, while Grace played nearby and Lily helped mark the furrows. The Reverend watched for a moment, then spoke.
"Mrs. Redfield, might I have a word?" Sarah stood, brushing dirt from her hands. "Of course, Reverend." He seemed nervous, uncertain how to begin. Finally, he just said it. "There's to be a memorial in Glenwood for the men who died in the mines. A monument of granite with all their names. Thomas will be on it, along with Margaret McAllister and the others. We're dedicating it next month. Thought you and Sheriff McAllister should know." Sarah felt something catch in her throat. A memorial. A permanent reminder that these lives had mattered, that their deaths meant something. That they would be remembered not just by their families, but by the community they had served. "Thank you, Reverend. We'll be there." On a warm Sunday in May, the entire town gathered on the hill overlooking Glenwood. The monument stood 8 feet tall, polished granite that caught the sunlight and threw it back in shades of gray and silver. Carved into its face were 31 names: Thomas Redfield, Margaret McAllister, Emma and Samuel McAllister. 27 miners whose wives and children stood weeping as the Reverend read each name aloud. Below the names, an inscription: "In memory of those who died, so others might live safely. Their truth brought justice. Their sacrifice brought change. May we never forget the price of silence." Sarah stood with Jacob, their hands clasped. Lily and Daniel on either side. Grace in Sarah's arms. A family built from loss and hope and the stubborn refusal to let tragedy have the final word. Around them, other families gathered, other widows, other orphans, all connected by grief and justice and the slow work of healing. When it was Sarah's turn to speak, she stepped forward, placed her hand on Thomas's name carved in stone, felt the rough granite under her palm, the permanence of it, the promise that he would be remembered. Thomas believed that doing right mattered more than doing easy, that we're measured not by our successes, but by how we treat those who can offer us nothing in return. He died trying to make his workplace safer, trying to protect the men he worked beside. And for 3 years, his death was called an accident, a tragedy that couldn't have been prevented. She turned to face the crowd, her voice stronger now, carrying across the hillside. But it wasn't an accident. It was murder, dressed up in corporate language and acceptable losses. And if Jacob McAllister hadn't stumbled bleeding into my life, if we hadn't found the map, if good people hadn't stood up and demanded justice,
Then Thomas and all the others would have died for nothing. Their deaths would have meant nothing, would have changed nothing. She looked at Jacob, at the man who had given her purpose when she thought she had none, who had taught her that mercy and justice were not opposing forces, but 2 sides of the same coin. But they did mean something. They meant everything. Because of them, mining laws have changed. Safety inspections are mandatory. Companies can't ignore worker concerns without facing real consequences. 31 men died, but because of their sacrifice, hundreds more will live. That's their legacy. That's what we remember today. The crowd was silent. Then someone began to clap, slowly at first. Then others joined, until the hillside rang with applause, with the sound of a community acknowledging its dead, honoring their sacrifice, promising to do better, to be better, to make sure that these deaths, at least, had purchased something worth having. After the ceremony, Jacob and Sarah walked through Glenwood together, the children running ahead, playing the way children do when the weight of grief has finally loosened its grip, when life reasserts itself despite loss, because of it, through it. They passed the old Blackwood mining office,
abandoned now, windows broken, weeds growing through cracks in the foundation. A monument of a different kind, to arrogance fallen, to greed punished, to the eventual triumph of justice over power. "How long will you wear the badge?" Sarah asked, not challenging, just curious, wanting to understand what the future held, what shape their lives would take now that the immediate crisis had passed. "As long as they need me." Jacob's answer was simple, honest. "Until I'm old and slow and some younger man can do it better. Then I'll retire to our cabin and let you teach me Apache, and I'll carve toys for our grandchildren." "Our grandchildren?" Sarah stopped walking, turned to face him.
Jacob met her eyes, not backing down, not apologizing for the presumption, just stating what he hoped might be true if she was willing. If she could imagine a future that included him permanently, officially, in all the ways that mattered. "I'm asking, Sarah. Not today, not tomorrow, but when you're ready. When enough time has passed that you can say yes without feeling like you're betraying Thomas's memory. I'm asking if you'll marry me. If you'll let me be a father to Lily and Daniel and Grace. If you'll let us build something together, not to replace what you had, but to honor it by living fully, by choosing hope over fear, by refusing to let loss be the end of the story." Sarah felt tears on her cheeks, good tears, healing tears, the kind that came when something frozen finally thawed, when winter finally released its grip and spring rushed in to fill the void. "Yes," she said it simply, certainly, without hesitation or doubt or the paralytic fear that had gripped her for so long. "Yes, when I'm ready, when the time is right, when we can stand before God and community and promise to build a life together. Yes." Jacob pulled her into his arms, held her close, and Sarah let herself be held. Let herself feel safe. Let herself believe that maybe the worst was over and the best was yet to come. That two people who had lost everything could find something together if they were brave enough, patient enough, willing to do the work. 5 years passed. The cabin grew again, a workshop for Jacob where he could work wood and repair tools and teach Daniel the skills every mountain boy needed. Another room added when Sarah gave birth to a son, Thomas Patrick McAllister, named for both fathers, for the men who had shaped their lives even in absence, even in death. A year later came Margaret Rose, named for Jacob's first wife, for the woman who had started the investigation that eventually brought Blackwood down, who had died trying to make the world better, who deserved to be remembered, honored, kept alive in story and name, even if she could never be brought back. Lily grew into a young woman, 14 years old and teaching alongside her mother, patient with the younger children, strict but kind, already showing signs of the teacher she would become, the leader she was meant to be. Daniel followed Jacob everywhere, learning tracking and shooting and the careful art of keeping peace in wild country. At 11, he was already talking about becoming a deputy, about following in the footsteps of the man he called Pa, even though he remembered his father, even though he honored Thomas's memory. Because Jacob had taught him that having two fathers, one in memory and one in life, wasn't a betrayal, it was a blessing. Grace was 5, wild and fearless, running through the mountains with the sure-footedness of someone who had Apache blood and mountain training. She tracked better than most grown men, could name every plant and tree, knew the old stories and the new ones. A bridge between worlds, between peoples, between what had been and what might yet be. On a warm evening in June, Sarah and Jacob sat on their porch watching the children play. The sun setting behind the Sangre de Cristo peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The world beautiful in that particular way it gets when you've survived darkness and come out the other side. When you've learned to appreciate the simple grace of being alive. Do you ever think about that day? Jacob's question was soft, almost dreamy, his hand finding Sarah's, their fingers interlacing with the easy comfort of people who had learned each other's rhythms, who moved together like water flowing around stone. Which day? The day I fell bleeding into your life. Sarah smiled, remembering. The stranger in the snow, the wanted poster she had burned, the choice that had seemed so small at the time, but had changed everything. Every day. Do you regret it? Not for 1 second. You were the best thing that ever collapsed in my yard. Jacob laughed, a full, rich sound that transformed his scarred face into something almost boyish. Sarah laughed too, and their children, hearing it, came running, piling onto the porch, filling the space with noise and life and the chaotic joy of family. Later, after the children were asleep, Sarah stood alone, looking at the monument in her mind. The names carved in granite on the hill above Glenwood. Thomas, Margaret, all the others who had paid the price for corporate greed and been vindicated by justice delayed but not denied. She thought about the choices that had brought her here. The decision to save instead of sell, to fight instead of flee, to open her heart again, even when it had seemed impossible, even when the risk felt too great, even when fear screamed that love only led to loss, and loss only led to pain. But she had been wrong about that. Love led to life, to children laughing, to communities rebuilding, to morning coffee and evening sunsets, and all the small, perfect moments that made up a life worth living. Yes, love could end in loss, but it could also end in legacy, in children raised and communities strengthened, and a future built from the ashes of the past. Sarah Nighthawk had found a dying man in the snow and chosen mercy. That choice had cost her a cabin and nearly cost her life. But it had also given her justice for her husband, purpose in her grief, and eventually, when she was ready, it had given her love again. Different from what she had known with Thomas, but no less real, no less precious, no less worth fighting for. In the remote valleys of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, where winter fog still clings to the hollows like the fingers of ghosts, there are stories of survival that defy belief. This was one of them. A story of an Apache widow and a mountain man, of mercy extended and justice claimed, of families lost and families built, of the long road from grief to healing, of the stubborn human capacity to hope even in the darkest winter, to love even after loss, to believe that tomorrow might be better than today if you're willing to do the work, to make the hard choices, to stand up when sitting down would be easier. Their story became legend in those mountains, passed down through generations, changed in the telling, as all stories are. But the core remained true. The heart of it never altered. One winter day in 1883, a woman saved a man's life, and in doing so, saved her own. The end.